This album was recorded from April through June of 1966, released August 5th, 1966. It's the Beatles' seventh studio album, and it's their final recording project before they quit touring. It was recorded after they took a 3-month break at the beginning of the year, and it's also considered the beginning of the band's psychedelic period. This is a very drug-influenced album. LSD was a prominent influence for the Beatles, well, at least for Lennon and Harrison. McCartney hadn't taken the drug yet. Brian Epstein, the band's manager, actually wanted them to make another film, kind of wanted them to keep going the same, directions that they had been doing in the past, but they kind of started vetoing him and, took a little bit of a break, and then they came back in the studio to, really expand their sound. But there was some controversy that peaked its head up before the release of the album, starting with the interview that John Lennon gave in March of 1966, where he said that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus Christ. Just as a comment, not like saying that, that they were better or anything like that, but that was taken not well, and people started burning Beatles records and, protesting them. All kinds of people, including the Klan. Like, Klan got really upset that they dissed Jesus Christ.
Great.
So there was lots of protesting around that. And then later on, more bizarrely, in June, they released the album, the U.S. album, Yesterday and Today. And I don't know if either of you guys have heard of that album or have, more importantly, seen the album cover of the Beatles, Yesterday and Today. Josh is shaking his head. John, are you familiar with that album cover?
I am not.
Okay. So in a attempt to kind of buck the system and show their avant-garde, leanings, the photographer had on hand had a number of different props available for them. And towards the end of the shoot, the Beatles found themselves dressed up in what appears to be kind of like butcher smocks, like these white smocks, and they have various doll parts, like the different pieces of dolls draped all over them, along with pieces of meat and what appears to be different types of organs like intestines and, lungs and stuff. And they're sitting there with big smiles on their faces. And it's a really weird looking album cover. So
still only the second worst album cover John Lennon ever did.
Very good point. A distant second at that. So as you can imagine, so this was released in the U.S., right? This isn't released in some kind of niche market. They put this out in the U.S., and fans and DJs were disgusted by what they saw on the album cover. And again, this was another thing that prompted them to get together and burn albums. The record company, the U.S. record company Capitol, was forced to recall the original Yesterday and Today albums at a cost of $250,000, which is almost $2 million today. So,
what was on the album? Was it just old?
It was
releases?
Yeah, it was just basically different. It was the same songs that were released in the UK, but just put on, like, there's 3 songs from Revolver that were put on it amongst songs previously from, like, maybe from Help and from Rubber Soul. So it's just one of those weird things that they were doing with, but this album goes out in the US and this album goes out in the UK. Okay. So because of these things, this album actually did not sell as well as Rubber Soul and previous albums did, although they did spend over 220 hours recording this record, as opposed to less than 80 that it took to record Rubber Soul. So even though that a lot of times people consider these two albums to be 1A, 1B, it's quite a step up, I think, when you compare what they were doing, at least in the studio, because they were definitely trying to be more experimental. Particularly, like the engineer Emmerich said that he's like, we don't want the guitars to sound like guitars, we don't want the pianos to sound like pianos. They actually, you might hear some backward sounding tracking parts on this album. And those were actually looped backwards, but they actually wrote those parts with that in mind. So they played them forward, but they knew that it was eventually going to go backwards. So Harrison was arranging that, knowing that, trying to kind of come up with the coolest combination that they could get a really interesting a backward track to go. So a lot of experimentation. McCartney also starts to become more of the equal. I know we talked about last time in Sgt. Pepper, where McCartney started taking, full reign, I guess you could say, over the band at that point. This is where they start to become equal. And if you on this record, you really have it's one of the most it's a very equalizing record for McCartney and Lennon. They both have 5 songs. Harrison's got 3, and then you've got Ringo singing a song. So that's one of the interesting things about this album. The variety is certainly there, not just with the sound, the structure of the songs, but also like the contributions.
Yeah, you can pick out who writes what song. Mm-hmm. After having listened to all these Beatles albums.
Yes. But they were still, this is still a happy time. The band was still getting along pretty well, even though at one point McCartney did walk off. He was having a little bit of a tiff, and he took off. So, that was happening. But overall, they certainly were getting along much better than they did in the White Album and Let It Be sessions and things like that. At the same time, the songs Rain and Paperback Writer were written and released as singles. They were not on this album, but they were singles only. And a couple of quotes about the record: Revolver expanded the boundaries of pop music, revolutionized standard practices in studio recording, advanced the principles espoused by the 1960s counterculture, and inspired the development of psychedelic rock, electronica, progressive rock, and world music, John's favorite. It also marked the start of a change in the Beatles' core audience, so they started seeing a little bit of a wane of their young female-dominated fan base, giving way to a little bit more increasingly, more serious, quote-unquote, serious-minded male listeners. And just a couple of words about the album cover, which won a Grammy of the year for album cover of the year. It was created by their friend Klaus Voormann, who they knew from back in their Hamburg days. He was one of the people that they hung out with back in Hamburg. And the album's name is a play not only on the gun, but the motion that the record makes while playing, in a revolving motion. So the Beatles they liked the double wordplay with certain words, hence the word Beatles. That's that's the creepy crawly things, but also beat music. So this was just another play on that. They originally wanted to call it Abracadabra, but apparently it wasn't Steve Miller that came up with that before them, but somebody else had an album out that was Abracadabra, so they didn't do it. They had several other different thoughts of what the album should be called. What my favorite one was Ringo's suggestion that in a response to the Rolling Stones' Aftermath, that they should name it after geography.
That would have been awesome.
You gotta love Ringo, don't you?
Yeah.
But he did hit a lot too. Like, we've talked many times about him naming songs, right?
What do you mean him naming songs?
Like, wasn't
yes,
wasn't like Lucy
yes.
in the Sky with Diamonds and stuff?
No, his was Tomorrow Never Knows. That
Tomorrow
was
Never Knows.
Hard
right?
Day's Night.
Hard Day's Night.
Yeah.
Yep.
Ringo's malapropism. So
so he had some hits.
He did. You're right. Yes, he did. He's he might be the funniest. I always get Ringo and he never takes himself too seriously. So anyway, the album got good reviews, sold well, but like I said, not as much as previous albums. And this is, in hindsight, we talked about Sgt. Pepper being the one that historically, or at least at least at the time that it came out, was the record that people really go to, saying that changed everything. But this album has benefited over the course of time, and it's surpassed Sgt. Pepper in a lot of charts. And many people consider this to be the Beatles' finest album. So what do you guys think? Let's start with you, Josh. Do you agree with that? Is this the Beatles' best album?
Is it their best album? I don't know if it's their best album, but it's definitely up there, as we've talked about with most of their albums. I see the progression from Rubber Soul to Sgt. Pepper, and having this in between. I can see the experimentation, and the use of different sounds. You've got the Indian music influence again in this, and that comes into play in Sgt. Pepper, as we commented on. And did they already go to India at this point, or come back? Did George go and come back?
No. The only experience George had, he saw a sitar player when they were filming Help, and then he used the sitar a little bit in Norwegian Wood.
Okay.
And then the rest, I don't think he had traveled to India at this point yet.
Okay.
Was there sitar in a Help song on Help too?
Not on Help, no. In the movie. In the movie, there was a scene where they were kind of in the Middle Eastern restaurant, and there was a sitar player there.
Yeah. So I can see it's in his head then, because that's clear. It's clear on this, at least two of the songs, Tomorrow Never Knows and Love You Too. And I think I really like, I don't think the songs are catchy, quote unquote, as they are on other albums, but I think there are a lot of good songs on here. I think there is a lot more deep cuts versus more like famous singles than, I mean, I think the most famous song on this album would probably be Yellow Submarine, right? And
that either that or Eleanor Rigby.
Yeah, that's.
I would say
probably
Eleanor
right.
Rigby. Yeah.
I mean, that was also side, 1A, 1B of the single. That was really, those were the Eleanor Rigby was the single, and then I think Yellow Submarine was the B side.
So there you go. So I think barring those two, where I think on other albums there are more recognizable hits per se, at least to modern ears. I think there's a lot of deeper songs on here that are good and show their kind of range and their willingness to push the pop genre forward and that rock and get out of their their beginnings. They're fully in this new phase, right, of the Beatles by this point, and you can see that, and I appreciate that. I think I've forgotten, even though I've heard this album many times, it seemed less recognizable to me on these listens than the other albums. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like White Album, I recognized way more songs on that than I did listening to this. I just kept thinking, oh yeah, that song. So that was a good experience. And I think my favorite songs on here are And Your Bird Can Sing and Yellow Submarine, I think are my favorites. And I'm Only Sleeping, I think that song is like really kind of weird. I like Lennon's voice. It seems kind of like slowed down or distorted in some way. Is there Mellotron on that too?
Probably. There's all kinds of stuff on here. I mean, like, I can probably look that up. If you look at this, there was a lot of experimentation. There was a lot of I'll double check on that, Josh. I'm not exactly sure if there was Mellotron, but.
And I appreciate, like you said, I like the split in the work or the songwriting and creation. I think they all contribute. I even, I like Ringo's singing once again on Yellow Submarine. I can't imagine another person singing that song. He's got like the perfect kind of laid back, confused singing voice or something like that. Like I don't know. He
sounds high, and the song's basically a song that is about being high. So
you're right. He's like his own little. He's like his own crazy character. I imagine he's how he is in real life in the movies that he was in Help and Hard Day's Night.
Yeah.
Just so you know, by the way, there is not Mellotron on I'm Only Sleeping. But
okay.
You know what I think you might is the backtracked guitar.
Okay. Yeah.
There is Mellotron. I mean, at some point Lennon played Mellotron because it is listed on here as one of the instruments. It doesn't indicate which song it was. It
doesn't look like it's I'm Only Sleeping. It mentions
it's probably
consistently about the backtrack guitar. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yep. I'll have to listen to it again knowing that. But yeah, this is a great album. I don't know, to sum up, if it's their best album, but and it's not my favorite, but it's probably in the top 5. So. But yeah. So. Sorry, I don't have any more original angles.
Do you have an opinion on what their best album is? Just out of curiosity, is that in your mind, or are you still not? Because it's totally understandable if you don't know yet, because there's so many to choose from.
I mean, I think their best album is Rubber Soul, in my opinion.
Okay,
but yeah.
Okay.
What were you gonna say, John? I feel like you're.
Why don't we wait? Why don't we wait? Because there's a couple left that I feel like
Okay.
It's not the time to quite but I can chime in on that because I was going to mention it. I think the thing that stood out to me was, now that we've listened to all the Beatles albums, coming into this I probably would have said Revolver was one of my 3 favorite Beatles albums, and definitively after these listens it's not. It's not that it's a bad album, but I clearly like the White Album, Rubber Soul, and Help better than I like Revolver. I think I like the idea of Revolver better than I like the album as a whole, because I like what it represents and where the Beatles are going, but I feel like they're a more finalized version of themselves after Revolver, in terms of where they were going, and I feel like the stuff before Revolver was more fun and melodic. And I think that what I realized was what I sometimes think Revolver is what Rubber Soul is, and Revolver is a whole different thing altogether. It's not quite Sgt. Pepper, but it's a lot more like Sgt. Pepper than it is like Rubber Soul, in my opinion.
I would agree with that.
Which is weird to say, because I don't think I would have ever said that going into this listen, but because I always categorize, Help, Rubber Soul, and Revolver as a packet of three, but I really came to realize that Revolver is definitely a late Beatles album after this. And it's really more Help and Rubber Soul that are paired albums for me in terms of what they're going for, more so than Rubber Soul and Revolver are. So that was my big takeaway from this album. It's still, nobody's better than the Beatles at writing albums that have a ton going on in them and great songs, but also in a concise manner that doesn't overstay its welcome by even a second. And that's something that I greatly appreciate with the Beatles. It's just it's an incredible skill they have that the more we listen to the Beatles and listen to other albums, the more I appreciate that the Beatles just have a gift for making pop music, but also making substantive pop music. It's remarkable. They rarely ever go too long.
Yeah, what other band, just to jump in, what other band can write a 2.5-minute song better than the Beatles can? Like, they are the masters at that.
Or a 2-minute song. Yeah. I mean, like, a lot of the songs don't even get to 2.5,
Yeah,
Yeah,
they're 2.5 on average, maybe.
Yeah, they're a remarkable writer of 2.5 minute songs. And Josh, I keep going back, like, having listened to that Elvis album that we did, the more I see that Elvis and the Beatles have kind of the same gift, where it's I don't know what it is, but they just have like a charisma and a way of crafting how they sound in their songs that you immediately know why they were a big deal. And there's nothing that changes that unless you're trying to have a contrarian opinion. And this is another example of that. There's just like really good songs littered throughout the entire album, from Here, There, and Everywhere I really like. Good Day Sunshine is just randomly thrown on there, but I would almost say that's like a single in its own right. Josh, you said another like track that's there. And Your Bird Can Sing is a really good song as identified by Matt and putting it in there. It's just littered with great songs. I think the only thing I don't love about this is just some of the experimentation feels a little bit forced to me. And that's a little bit of that going into that world music direction. I like where they went by the White Album and later albums. We haven't covered Abbey Road yet. We haven't covered Let It Be yet. So we can go kind of have that conversation later. But I kind of like where they went when they polished off those edges and it became more of a refined sound as opposed to like novelty seeking. And that's what this feels like at times. Just like, oh, here's the sound I like. Let me just randomly throw it in. And that's where it kind of becomes a little bit like Frank Zappa and stuff, where it's like, there's all these sounds. Some are interesting, some are not as interesting, but we'll just throw all of them in and see what you like. So, but unlike Zappa, it never gets kind of indulgent. And that goes back to just at the end of the day, you've got master songwriters. There you go. That's my take on Revolver.
So it's interesting because I remember George Harrison did one of the interviews on the Anthology documentary, and he said that he always viewed Rubber Soul and Revolver as 1A, 1B. He never really saw too much difference there. And he's like, I'm not sure. I never really played them back to back. And
he's totally wrong, by the way, after listening to this. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that I always, Revolver and Rubber Soul are usually lumped together. You're right, John, that's kind of the two that are viewed as the bridge albums, And I think that I can see what you're saying there, that Rubber Soul and Help are much more in line than Rubber Soul and Revolver are. And I think I easily agree with that. I love this record, and it's not my favorite, but it's definitely, like I said, this is in the top 4. I think one of the things that I like the most about this is the variety of the songwriters. And I think this might be the Beatles album that it includes just a little bit of everything that the Beatles did before and would do after in some respects. And I think in that way,
that's a fair point.
It's maybe the most, I could see why someone would say it's the best Beatles album. I'm not going to argue with that. It's not my favorite, but it's certainly up there. I think it's definitely the most representative of the. If you wanted one album, to be like, if you want just an idea of what the Beatles did for everything, here's a half hour instead of going through like 9-10 albums. This would be the. I mean, I couldn't point to another album that would do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
because every other album. So, and I think that the songwriting. I don't think it gets terribly indulgent. I mean, I think Tomorrow Never Knows is by far the most experimental song on this, and they put it at the end.
The writing doesn't get indulgent. I think sometimes the musicianship and jamming stuff in is a little bit of
but I don't mind. Like when you talk about a song like "Love You To," like the Harrison song that's all like sitar. I love what he's doing. It's just such a cool sound what he's doing with that, and it's not. And I think it's a very. I think he went downhill when he did. When you compare "Love You to Within You Without You," at least musically speaking, because that song.
I'm not a fan of really either of them, to be quite honest. But it's certainly a fair argument you can make if you're ranking Beatles sitar.
Well, look at it like this, John. This is 3 minutes, right? It's faster, right? Okay, it's a faster pace. There's more. There's different things that are happening within the song, whereas Within You Without You is like over 5 minutes long, and it's like basically the same kind of thing throughout the whole song. Yeah. So to me, it's a more interesting song, and I don't mind it. I like that it's thrown in there. It's the only song that sounds like that. It's not like they were saying, hey, let's put a sitar on everything. That's the other great thing about this is when they do something experimental, they get in, they get out, and they move on to something else, right? Yeah. Eleanor Rigby, holy crap, what a great song that is, right? Like the way they do that with the strings and McCartney's voice is just great. I definitely think I like the first half of this record better than the second half. And
I would agree with that.
And that's mainly because I think I say weakest songs, they're all great, but there's 3 songs on the second side that kind of drag a little bit for me when compared to the others, and that includes...
Let me guess. Can I
Go
guess?
Go ahead.
For No One, Dr. Robert, and I Want to Tell You. Are those
so Dr. Robert, I Want to Tell You, yes. No, for No One, I think that's a beautiful song. I love that song. I love that McCartney song. Actually
kind of like I Want to Tell You
because
it's a throwback.
Okay.
Really? Okay. I think I Want to Tell You is kind of like a throwback to earlier Beatles, which I kind of liked. Because you need that.
Yes.
You need that. If you're going to tell the story of the Beatles like as a representative album, right, you have to have a song that represents that. So it kind of fits into what you said, yeah.
Yeah, no, and like I said, I like them all, but when I compare those to like, Here, There, and Everywhere, I'm Only Sleeping, Eleanor Rigby, Taxman, what a great way to enter the song. And George gets first billing right up front. And so I just...
And the guitar on that's really great.
Yeah, and that actually was true because he talks about the taxes that they got in there. He's like, they had to pay, like, at a certain point, they had to pay 95% of their taxes. And so their accountants came up to them and was like, 2 of you are almost are bankrupt and 2 of you are about to be bankrupt. So we got to start doing something different. So, but then you get, and I love Tomorrow Never Knows. It's insane. It was something that they talk about something that's totally different. And that's really what kind of set the stage for what was to come later on with Sgt. Pepper and the experimentation there. But I agree with those that say that this is a better record than Sgt. Pepper. It's an easy yes for me in that regard. I think I'm. See, the problem I think when I'm ranking these albums, I think the White Album suffers from too many filler songs, and that's mainly because it's a double album, right? It also has Revolution 9. It's got 9 minutes of a song that I have to skip, and I almost like if I'm going to nitpick, like when I'm going to be ranking albums, as a whole, you have to include Revolution 9, and I'm sorry, this is a better album than the White Album.
But there's like 5 tracks off the top of my head on the White Album that are better than anything on this album. I'm not going to argue that. I could see why you would say that, but if you're looking at the album as a whole, that's something that I've always felt like with albums. If you're going to be up there, you got to be perfect, right? Or damn near close to it. And it's not just Revolution 9. I think there's some other songs on the White Album that are a little bit, throwaway songs for me, like Good Night, Long, Long, Long is a song that I never really got that into. So there's several songs on that you're like, eh. And that's one of the knocks against the White Album, right? But it's still the White Album, and it's great, and whatever. Yeah. But like again, you're nitpicking. But this, God, it's hard to pick, but this is up there. I probably would put it ahead. Every time I listen to one of these, I'm like, this is number 2, right? So this is number 2 for today. Let's put it that way.
Sure.
So is that where you'd couch it in terms of Beatles albums we've covered so far, Matt? You would put it number 2?
No, that would put it number 1 because we haven't covered my number 1 yet.
Wow, so it's your favorite. Okay.
Saving it for the end. So, Matt, one thing
it's number 4 for me, just for context,
okay,
of albums we've covered so far.
You said this album didn't sell as well. Is that because some of the negative press that they received, that actually affected sales as well?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't read exactly about all the figures and stuff, but it just said there was a notation in there that said it sold well, but it didn't sell as well as other stuff. But also, this is a jump forward, and this is starting. People that are big into the Beatles, like all those teeny bopper girls and stuff that they had huge fans, were like, "What are they doing? What is this sitar thing? You know, what tomorrow never knows."
There's the single would have been Paperback Writer, which they didn't release on this.
Well, they also, like I said earlier, they did release Eleanor Rigby and Yellow Submarine as a single as well.
But when you're used to hearing the Beatles and you hear Eleanor Rigby, as good a song as it is, let's be honest. Like, you're not going to process Yellow Submarine and Eleanor Rigby. Like, even in Rubber Soul, right? You know, they were still throwing red meat to people that were processing the Beatles as, you know, what they were before. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's Drive My Car, there's still stuff in there. Michelle, you know what I mean, that you can get in there. This album is very much different.
That's true. Yeah, this is gonna be a little off-putting for a lot of those fans. That's true.
It's just different, you know what I mean? And you know, Eleanor Rigby is a great song. It's talk about a quarantine song. My God, it's about being isolated and alone when you're old, right? You know, speaking of Ringo though, wasn't Ringo the guy that came up with like the best line of that song? If I remember watching the anthology or something where he said writing the words of a sermon that no one will hear, which is by far the best lyric in that song. So
they all, interestingly enough, that's a McCartney song, but I think they all contributed in some way to the lyrics. That's true. Yeah.
Are we redeeming Ringo here? Like, that's
you have to go back
goal,
and
this is the Ringo positive podcast.
And didn't George Harrison write the like hook of Eleanor Rigby too? So
all of the lonely people, the main part of the song was George Harrison. Yes.
And as much as I love Paul McCartney, he's a master songwriter. That's when you think about Harrison wrote the hook and then Ringo wrote the best line. It's kind of like, oh, look at that. You know, the lesser known Beatles.
Also at this time, this is one of the reasons I don't like McCartney as much, because I guess Harrison needed a little help writing some words in Taxman. And so John was like busy, and he asked John for help, and John was like, he didn't want to do it, but he finally said, all right, fine. He goes, because I knew Paul wasn't going to help him, because Paul wasn't going to be able to give him any help at all. And Paul and George Paul definitely always looked down on George. So, I never really liked that as much, because I always loved George. But and speaking of Eleanor Rigby, John, I came across this quote from Ray Davies. He was not a fan of Eleanor Rigby, and I think it's kind of
veering into his territory a little bit.
I know. Well, you had mentioned that like Ray Davies was a better slice of life writer than Paul McCartney. You felt like from
although this was a pretty damn good slice of life song. Yeah. Although we now know that Paul McCartney wrote some of it. So
that's true. But he dismissed it as, quote, a song to please music teachers in primary schools. Adding that, I can imagine John saying, "I'm going to write I'm going to write this for my old school mistress." But still, it's very commercial. John said that, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, John Lennon said that about. Oh, yeah. Okay,
like he would say that. So, but yeah, Ray
I
Davies
know he notoriously hates Eleanor Rigby, John Lennon, which it just seems to me that he's bitter that it was a good song that he really didn't have much to do with, right?
That's probably the funny thing is when you read all these quotes about like who wrote what parts and stuff like that. There's all, depending on which interview and what year you're reading it from, it's totally different. But John seems very dismissive of particularly Paul's stuff, some of George stuff as well. And Paul always comes in and takes credit.
Well, that's all the rest of the stuff, isn't it? Because there's not Ringo stuff, really.
Well, no, right. But that's what I'm saying. Like, John is very dismissive of, like, he's like, whatever, that wasn't that great. And but he's also dismissive of some of his own stuff. But Paul is also very much like, saying, like, actually, I wrote 70% of In My Life, it's stuff like, it's like, did you really, Paul? So it's, you can never take what they say at face value, I guess.
Right.
Through the haze of LSD and everything else.
Yeah, God knows what they were eating that stuff for breakfast.
I got curious. Apparently, Ray Davies was not a fan of Revolver as an album much at all.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was not a big fan of a lot of the songs on it. So, yeah.
Well, I disagree with Mr. Davies there, but I also appreciate his music too. So that's all good.
He was going through some shit at the time. I think the nervous breakdown was coming, right? So, yeah.
Yeah.
So, listeners, let us know your Beatles albums rankings once we're done with the.
Don't we have to wait till we do Abbey Road?
I said once we're done.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Yeah.